Good evening and welcome to the 16th annual Potter Lecture in the Earth Sciences Department at Dickinson College. My name is Ben Edwards. I'm the department chair, and we're very happy to have a number of distinguished guests here today. We have Professor Potter with us in the virtual world. And the Noel Potter Jr. Geology Lectureship was started by alumni of the Geology Department to honor Emeritus Professor Noel Potter on the occasion of his retirement in 2004. One of our alums, George Lee, who is from the class of 1971, led the charge to raise a generous endowment from fellow geology alumni to fund this annual lecture in honor of Noel's 36 years of service at the college. During that time, Noel taught 3,178 students, a big number, in physical geology and 233 majors in field and structural geology. Noel, you don't need to stand, but maybe you can wave vigorously to the camera so everyone can see you.
It does anything unless I speak.
There you go.
Wow, can you hear me?
We can hear you. So it's great to have Noel with us, and we have a number of other special guests. But one in particular to introduce the main speaker tonight. We're very fortunate to have one of our distinguished alums, Everett Lasher, and I'm going to let Everett take over from here.
Oh, thank you so much, Ben, and again, thanks to everyone for being here tonight. I'm very, very happy to introduce the speaker for this year's Potter Lecture, Dr. Yarrow Axford. Yarrow is an associate professor at Northwestern University in the Earth and Planetary Sciences Department, where she's been since 2010. Dr. Axford received her BA in geology from Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts, went on to receive her master's from Utah State University, and completed her doctorate in geological sciences from the University of Colorado Boulder before moving to Northwestern University. Yarrow has been studying the Arctic and the subarctic region for over 2 decades, taking her to places such as Alaska, Arctic Canada, Iceland, and Greenland over 12 times. I don't know the exact number, she can correct me, in pursuit of valuable geologic data that has helped the science community better understand how Earth's climate has changed in the past and helped us understand what might happen in the future. She is a recipient of the National Science Foundation's Career Award for Early Career Scientists, among other awards. And apart from her research in the Arctic, is a leading advocate for women in science, everyone in STEM, science, technology, education, math, and a firm advocate for communicating science to the broader community, really to anyone. And beyond all of this, I have a special personal connection. So after graduating from Dickinson and learning from many of the esteemed faculty who are joining us tonight, Yarrow invited me to Evanston and Northwestern University a few years ago. And as she put it in an email, to live, learn, and ponder the sedimentary records of paleoclimate. And for 6 years, she helped, and she was a mentor and a guide and taught me about the Earth system, helped me appreciate getting muddy and the benefits of bugs and lake sediments, and all the skills needed to survive a summer of field work in Greenland. So this is a real honor, and it's my real pleasure to formally introduce Dr. Yarrow Axford as this year's Potter Lecture.
Wow, thank you so much, Everett. That's such a nice surprise, and honestly the nicest introduction I've ever had. And thanks everyone for being here, and thanks to Ben and the faculty of the department, and especially to Noel for the opportunity to do this. I certainly wish that it was in person and that I was sitting with you all in a room in person today in Pennsylvania, but given that we cannot do that, I'm going to instead welcome you to my research lab for the evening and tell you about the work that we do. And the first thing I want to do is give a shout out to the people who really make the research happen in the field and in the lab, and who really bring the deepest expertise to what we do. And that's the students, the graduate students, the undergraduates, and also the postdocs and lab technicians who really do this work and make it happen. And in particular, shout out to Everett, who you just saw, and who was one of my two very first PhD students. It's a bit of a leap of faith to take on a PhD advisor who has no track record of taking on PhD students. So thank you, Everett, for having faith in me back in the beginning. Also, thank you to the organizations that have funded my recent work. And third, and perhaps most importantly, I want to say thank you to the people who call the Arctic home for welcoming generations of scientists to their countries and to their land to investigate environmental change. Those of us who live as far south as most of us do tend to think of the Arctic as this vast, unoccupied, empty wilderness, and indeed, parts of it certainly can feel that way, but it's also home to about 4 million people. And I'll talk about research in Arctic Canada and Greenland in particular today, and in those two places, the vast majority of people who live in Arctic Canada and Greenland are indigenous to the Arctic. So their ancestors had lived in these environments for thousands of years. These are the people who are most dramatically affected by the climate and environmental change that I'm going to talk about today. So I hope that we all have them in the forefronts of our minds as we think about these changes and how they also affect us much farther south. So I'm a teacher, so I want to start out with a pop quiz. When you hear the term Arctic climate change, what is the first image that pops into your mind? If you are like Google, it's something like this. It's some kind of ice, and there's a decent chance there's a polar bear standing on sea ice in your head. And that's a reasonable thing to think of when you think of Arctic climate change, because for sure, this is arguably the part of the Earth's system that is changing the fastest before our eyes, even speaking globally. And it's certainly a really rapidly changing part of the Arctic system. In this figure in the turquoise color in the middle, you're seeing for the year 2015, the extent of Arctic ocean ice cover at the end of summer. So the minimum for that year. And every summer the ice shrinks to a minimum, and then sometime in mid-September, winter comes to the Arctic Ocean and it starts to grow and grow again to something like what you see colored in white in this map, which is the maximum winter extent in 2015. And we pay, as a scientific community, a lot of attention to that minimum summer extent every year as a way to track the sort of health of the sea ice cover. But a lot of other people pay attention to that too, because that controls the ability of ships to traverse the Arctic and the seaways around the margins of the Arctic. It controls where we're able to access for looking for minerals and petroleum, where tourist cruise ships can go, and where cargo ships can go. And there have been several firsts for Arctic ship traffic in just the last 10 or 11 years, opening up of some passages. And there's a really big question still out there when that pink line, the transpolar sea route that basically goes over the North Pole, might be open in summer. At that point, that will mean that there is very, very little sea ice left in the Arctic in summer. Another way to look at this as a trend over time is by looking at this graph, which shows for each data point the area of the ice pack in the Arctic at the end of the summer for a given year. So each data point is 1 year, minimum size of the sea ice in that year, going back to 1979. And clearly there's a very, very strong trend here, an enormous change in conditions in the Arctic Ocean just in my lifetime, and since I was in elementary school and junior high. In 2020, a couple months ago, we saw the second smallest extent of Arctic sea ice on record. Of course, there's also a lot of ice on land in the Arctic. And by far, the biggest hunk of that is the Greenland Ice Sheet. So this is the only ice sheet remaining in the Northern Hemisphere. And it's a very, very big mass of ice. If all of the ice in the Greenland Ice Sheet were to make its way into the ocean, it would add about 22 feet on average to sea level all around the world. We're stuck on this planet with this reality that the more water we store on land as ice, the lower global sea levels will be. And conversely, if we melt or flow more of that land ice into the ocean, we raise global sea level. And now we're just stuck with that basic fact. So if the Greenland Ice Sheet loses mass, that will raise global sea levels, potentially a lot. The Antarctic ice sheet is Earth's other remaining ice sheet. It, by the way, is about 10 times as large as the Greenland ice sheet. But the Greenland ice sheet is enormous. It's mind-bogglingly big. And maybe some of you have had the pleasure of seeing this thing up close and personal, or maybe you've flown over the Atlantic Ocean and looked out the window and thought, what am I seeing out the window? And realized that it was the ice sheet. You kind of can't believe your eyes the first time you see it because of its scale. And it is changing very rapidly before our eyes. So here are the data. This is the most recent study I'm aware of, looking at mass balance of the Greenland ice sheet in recent decades. And so what you're seeing here are colored lines representing cumulative gain or loss of mass by the ice sheet over time, by changes in surface melt, that's the green line, changes in flow dynamics, which are the light blue, and the sum of those two things, which is total mass change. And anytime those lines are above zero, the ice sheet's gaining mass. Anytime they're below zero, it's in the red, it's losing mass. And so you can see here that since about the mid-1990s, the ice sheet has consistently lost mass, but that there was a turning point sometime after about the year 2000 when mass loss from the ice sheet accelerated pretty dramatically. The Arctic's also home to tens of thousands of smaller glaciers. This is one in a national park in Alaska where the Park Service places signs every few years to kind of show where the front of the glacier snout sits, and there are people on the right for scale. This is a study that summarizes what's been happening with small glaciers around the entire world since 1961. And basically every bubble represents a volume of ice lost from glaciers in a region. And I've put those dark bands around the regions that are either Arctic or subarctic, from Alaska to the Canadian Arctic, Greenland, Svalbard, Russia. You can clearly see that the vast majority of global ice loss from small glaciers has come from the Arctic and subarctic. So there's evidence of really rapid change in the Arctic. We also know that temperatures themselves are rising quickly, but all of this information is fundamentally part of a really short records, really short periods of measurement. And that's because all the data I've shown you so far tonight come from mostly satellite-based measurements. So we're limited to the satellite era and mostly 1980s and after. Or for something as seemingly simple as measuring temperature, which only requires a thermometer at a weather station, even that, at a lot of places in the Arctic, really limits how far back in time we can go, because a lot of the weather stations around the Arctic today, they're sparse even today, but a lot of those didn't exist until the Cold War, when a lot of infrastructure was built around the Arctic, and a lot of airfields to allow access to things like radar stations and so on that were built in North America and Russia to spy on each other across the Arctic Ocean. the image on the left here is from Thule Air Base. It's the northernmost US military installation in the world. It's in northwest Greenland. Lots of big radar dishes and various ways of looking at Russia and the Arctic Ocean. So all this infrastructure built in the Cold War, weather stations built during the Cold War, satellites looking at the Arctic since about the 1980s, that's the data set that we have to work with to try to evaluate what's been happening over the Arctic, and to try to understand how profound of a change it really is. We don't have a longer baseline from instrumental measurements that can tell us whether these really rapid changes we're seeing are truly abnormal, or whether they might be part of some kind of long-term multi-decade natural cycles or something like that. So that's where we're going to turn to geology, and in my case to lake mud. Sediments that have been deposited in the bottoms of lakes year after year after year in nice layers that tell us we have time preserved. And this is a core that we captured in East Greenland that contains only the surface most sediment from this lake. And the great thing about this core is it uses a device that captures this uppermost really soft mud very, very carefully so that the recent record is preserved intact. And that orange layer there is the sediments that are kind of presently being deposited the very top of the sediment package. And then there's nice clear lake water above. So that's a very recent record. So I want to basically talk tonight about using lake sediments to answer two particular questions that provide context for recent warming in the Arctic. And one of those questions is how unusual is the warming itself? And the other is how unusual is recent glacier loss or retreat in the Arctic? So examples from my research tonight are going to focus on those two questions. But I want to mention that, of course, the field of paleoclimatology is much, much more broad than that and can contribute all kinds of things to understanding Earth's climate, far beyond just providing a sort of context for recent change. My work, really the vast majority of it focuses on other types of questions that have more to do with trying to understand how climate works. So going back to times in Earth's past when climate was doing something interesting, changing in a big way, and trying to figure out how those past climate changes worked, and also what their impacts were on things like ice sheets, ecosystems, species migrations, or extinctions. But I'll focus on those yellow questions tonight. So I want to kind of take you on a trip into the field in just a moment. But first, the basic principle of paleolimnology is that we're really lucky to be able to take advantage of the fact that stuff piles up in the bottoms of lakes over time. And that stuff comes from whatever was living in the lake or whatever was living around the lake on land, stuff that's blown over the lake or washed into the lake and streams. All of it can potentially settle through the water column and end up in nice layers in the bottom of the lake. And all that stuff potentially tells us something about the environment surrounding the lake in the past. So my group heads out into the field and on the lake ice or some kind of platform basically attempts to drive some kind of tube down into the mud, bring it up and take it back to the lab. So I want to show you some photos that give you a sense for what that process really looks like. This is a current grad student, Laura LaRocca, who Everett knows well and has worked with. She is showing off some of the gear for a field season in Greenland. And I just put this slide in here to mention that I'd say about 90% of what we do in field work and before field seasons and after field seasons is just move stuff around. There's so much stuff because when we're working at remote sites in particular, typically we have to go to the site with literally every nut and bolt, every piece of paper, every battery, every calorie, every piece of tape that we might want for that entire field season, every piece of clothing for every type of weather we might encounter. So this stuff adds up really fast, even though we try to keep it to a minimum. And here we are in a warehouse. This is at Thule Air Base, so US Air Force Base in Northwest Greenland, very far north. We're about to head out to a remote field site, and beforehand, we're just checking that all the gear that we shipped up to Greenland is actually intact, and everything that's supposed to inflate all the boats will stay inflated, and we have all the pieces of this raft that we're constructing there that's going to go on those red pontoons and become our coring platform. And then the stuff has to get out to the field site, and for the majority of our work in Greenland, that requires a helicopter. But there are some other ways to get around. Sometimes we're really lucky and we're working near the coast and we're working in a populated area. Maybe we can get a lift from a local person who has a boat. Sometimes you're lucky and you have a graduate student like Everett who's a willing pack horse and can carry lots of stuff across land to a field site. So on the field trip that you see on the right here, we took a boat on the ocean to a coastline that was near a lake, and then had to physically carry all the stuff that you see in that picture on the right to the lake inland, doing what you see Everett doing in the pictures in the left. So the exact way we get around and exactly what season makes sense to put an us shore of a lake and camp there while we construct a platform to head out onto the lake, all toward the goal of sinking a piece of pipe down into the mud. So that's what you see here. It's the white thing at the bottom of this image is a plastic PVC pipe from Home Depot, plastic sewer pipe. Above that is a brass cylinder that weighs about 40 pounds that is then connected to two white ropes that extend all the way up to the water surface where the people are. And when the people pull on those white ropes, it lifts that 40-pound weight up, slides up that metal rod. And when they let go of the ropes, the weight free falls and lands on the top of that pipe and drives it a little further down into the mud. So you lift the rope and drop it, lift the rope and drop it about a zillion times until the tube is driven all the way down into the mud. And this is what the process looks like up above the water. They're lifting the hammer, lifting that weight. The ropes are on pulleys, so they're pulling down to lift up. And it's a lot of work. These guys are making it look easy. And on the left side, you see someone taking notes because we're always tracking really precisely what's happening and how far down in the mud we are. And eventually, if it goes well, you do this for a really long time, you eat some Cliff Bars and some beef jerky, and you do it some more, and eventually your tube is full of mud, and you get to pull it up and hopefully have a beautiful lake core to take home. The core on the right that we're so happy about happens to contain mud that's 120,000 years old. So that's part of why we look so pleased with ourselves. So if we do our jobs well, inside these tubes, we capture beautiful layers of mud that represent time intact. And the middle image here is an X-ray of a core. The right image is a thin section on a microscope slide. So you can see that even in the finest level, a carefully taken core has beautiful preservation of stratigraphy. And within those layers of mud are just an absolutely infinite mix and array of indicators of past environments. So here you're seeing the top image is a pollen grain that can tell you about the plants that grew in the vicinity of the lake in the past, a volcanic ash grain below that. The brown thing is part of an insect. And to the right of that is a lake algae, a diatom that can tell us things about lake water chemistry and about light penetration into the water column, which in the Arctic often tells us about ice cover. And when we get these sediments into the lab, there's just an infinite range of things that we can potentially extract that can tell us something about past environments. It's really limited only by scientific creativity, our understanding of chemistry or physics or biology, and our analytical capabilities of kind of what we can actually measure and see in the lab. So I want to put these tools to work to answer the first question for tonight, which is how unusual is this recent rapid warming that we're seeing in the Arctic? And to answer that question, we're going to travel about 2,000 miles north of Dickinson to Baffin Island in the Canadian Arctic, to this community, which is called Clyde River. It's a coastal community, so it sits on a bay that's covered with ice in this photo. This photo was taken in May. Everything's still frozen solid. And what we're going to do is take snowmobiles a few miles outside this small community to get to a lake that's very, very remote. There are lakes just dotting this entire landscape, lots and lots of lakes that hardly ever are visited by people, occasionally maybe by an ice fisherman or fishermen, but they're very, very unimpacted, remote, pristine lakes, pristine ecosystems. That's the idea, is to go to places, in the case of this study, where any climate signal, any temperature signal that we might be able to find in lake sediments hasn't been overprinted by some stronger local human influence, like we would see in like Lake Michigan offshore of me right here in Chicago. So we're here on the lake in May to get a core. In this case, we auger down through the very thick lake ice and eventually pull up a short, beautiful core that captures a sediment record that extends all the way up to present. Because remember, we want to look at recent warming and compare that to a longer term geologic history. So we've used a special coring device that's really good at getting those kinds of surface cores, and we're slicing off 1/4 centimeter slabs of the core into baggies to make sure that that very detailed recent stratigraphy makes it home intact. And the data set that I'm going to show you from this particular core is a biological proxy, which like many biological proxies for past climate, harnesses the idea of species environment associations. And that's something that you're all familiar with, that's intuitive. If in this core you found a palm frond or some remains of a palm tree, you would infer something very different about the past climate of this site than if you found remains of the evergreen on the right? That species environment associations, and it's a really powerful concept in paleoecology and paleoclimate research. You can use it for all kinds of different species that are environment sensitive. And in this case, I'm going to use a family of flies called chironomids, or non-biting midges, that happen to have very temperature sensitive species distributions. So you can use the mix of species that you find in a layer of lake mud to infer what temperature used to be. And I'm happy to talk in more detail about how any of these methods work when we have time for questions. But I'll just describe it real briefly now. In the lab, we pick out remains of individual insect larvae one by one. It's a very fussy, tedious work, but a lot of fun too. And we find these heads of larvae by the tens to thousands in a gram of sediment, and ultimately squish them onto microscope slides, and their teeth parts, the geometry of their teeth parts, allow us to tell what species or what genus each head belongs to. So we can get a very good sense of what midges lived at the lake in the past and relate that to the temperatures that those species prefer, and actually quantitatively reconstruct past temperatures. So this is the result of doing that for this particular core, which extends back about 2,000 years. So we're in years AD here, from 0 all the way up to 2005, which was the present day of when we took this core. There's a pretty big change at the end, but even more than this quantitative reconstruction of temperatures, what just really hit me over the head doing this analysis was seeing under the microscope the actual change in what insects were at this lake over time. Because what we saw was that there's always a pretty big mix of species, a bunch of different species around. And throughout the last 2,000 years, and in fact, the last 8,000 years, we later found at this site, among those species that lived at this site were 2 species of chironomids that you only find in the very, very, very coldest Arctic lakes today. They're the most cold-loving chironomid species in the Northern Hemisphere. And they were really happy at this lake for 8,000 years. And then in 1950, they started to decline. And around 1980 and after, they're completely absent from the sediments. So happy for 8,000 years, as far as we could tell, gone after 1980. That's why you see this big hookup in temperatures in the late 20th century in this record. But this, of course, is one method at one site. We don't have a whole lot of data points on this curve because this method is so time intensive. We did not do it at very high temporal resolution. It can certainly tell us something about the history of this one site, but it's not an Arctic-wide story. However, around the same time that I was doing that work, I had the chance to work with a big international collaboration that was asking, what if we compile all the paleo temperature reconstructions that have been published ever for the Arctic that go back at least 1,000 years, and we put them all together, what will they collectively tell us about 1,000 or 2,000 years of temperature history over the Arctic? So we did that exercise and sought out every record we could find. And what we came up with was, I think, 23 records, some from tree rings, some from ice cores, and some from lake sediments. But we had a rule for this study that these records had to have at least a data point every decade to be included. And so the record that I just showed you based on chironomids is not part of this study. It's much too coarsely resolved in time to make that cut. But we found 23 records that did have a data point every decade, went back at least 1,000 to 2,000 years. Notice that tree ring records are limited to places where there are trees in the Arctic. Ice core records are limited to places where there are long-lived, stable glaciers. Lakes, on the other hand, are almost everywhere. And so they have great potential to fill in geographic gaps. So what we did, in essence, was to average those 23 records to derive an Arctic-wide temperature reconstruction. And this is the result of doing that. The blue line is the result. The red line is weather station data for the Arctic as a whole for comparison. And the weather station data here seem to be telling us that our proxies from ice and trees and lakes are doing a pretty good job capturing temperature. So there's a couple big things visible in this result. One is this gradual cooling that we see over the last 2,000 years. And that really wasn't a surprise to those of us involved with this study, because geologists have known for decades that the Arctic has been cooling overall for several thousand years due to very slow, very predictable changes in Earth's orbit and axial tilt. So what the geoscientists in the audience know as Milankovitch forcing. More specifically, it turns out that whereas the North Pole today points towards Polaris, our axis actually wobbles over time, so that's not always the case. And Earth's orbit is eccentric and not perfectly round. When you combine those effects and changes in Earth's tilt over time, you get Milankovitch forcing. But more specifically, when we're talking about the Holocene, what really matters to the Arctic through the Holocene, or the last about 11,000 years, in the early Holocene, so the right part of this diagram labeled 13,000 years ago, during the Northern Hemisphere summer, when the Arctic is experiencing 24 hours of sunlight, Earth is actually closer to the sun than it is in present day Northern Hemisphere summers. And so summer sunlight was more intense in the Arctic in the early Holocene, and that's enough to have a pretty big effect on Northern Hemisphere climate, and especially Arctic climate, and make it warmer. That we've been drifting very, very slowly and predictably towards the modern day configuration for the last 13,000 years, and that's driven overall cooling. So we see that in this reconstruction, which is really cool. And then we see that trend interrupted in the 20th century by an abrupt warming, when Milankovitch forcing should be continuing to cause steady cooling in the Arctic. Natural forcing should be causing the Arctic to continue to cool. And in fact, gradually cool over tens of thousands of years into the next ice age. Instead, we're seeing this abrupt warming in the 20th century. And my last figure, before we take a bit of a pause for questions midway, is also from the same study. It's a different way of looking at the same data. And I think it's, to me, an even more interesting way. So what you're seeing here is a graph where each black dot represents a 100-year slice of that last graph. 100 years of temperature reconstruction averaged into one temperature anomaly, which is what's plotted on the y-axis. And then on the x-axis, for that 100-year time slice, for each 100-year time slice, we've plotted the intensity of summer sunlight, summer solar energy, so the climate forcing. And you can see these two things are very strongly correlated throughout 19 centuries of this 2,000-year record, until we plop the 20th century onto this graph. And suddenly we have the warmest century of the record during a period when solar intensity is the lowest. It's pretty clear from this that something else is driving the bus in the 20th century, that something has overridden natural climate forcing, or certainly that Milankovitch forcing. So I'm going to shift to question 2 and talk about mountain glaciers in the Arctic. But before I do that, I just wanted to invite a question or two midway through, in case someone has one.
Yarrow, so we have a question from Marcus Key. He wonders, what techniques do you use to determine absolute age?
Oh yeah, good question. Radiocarbon for most of what we do, radiocarbon dating. In a typical lake core, we're really lucky to find a lot of plant remains that are easily datable with radiocarbon. For the uppermost part of a story, for the last 150 to 200 years, we use lead-210 dating, and sometimes also a cesium spike from atmospheric nuclear weapons testing, which gives us a really clear sort of marker of the 1960s, as grim as that dating method is.
Marcus has a follow-up. He wonders about things like counting varves, or are they too disturbed, or do you see varves in most of the lakes that you core?
Yeah, so varves are annual layers that can be identified as such, kind of like tree rings or annual layers in ice cores. And I would love to be able to work with varves, but I've never had the privilege of working on a clearly varved lake. And that's partly because I myself work mostly with biological proxies, and that means seeking out lakes where there's a lot of biology and typically a pretty healthy benthic ecosystem, and all those little critters living in the uppermost sediments in the benthic environment stir up the sediments. And so even if there is a process in the lake that generates distinctly different types of sediment in winter versus summer, that distinction gets blurred by bioturbation. So I haven't had the chance to work with varves, but maybe someday.
And I expect, just to follow up, and there's another question too, but you also probably, you might need a different technique, right? Because if you're processing the cores in the field, like with varves, you'd almost have to bring an intact core back. Is that right?
Definitely, yeah. And for the vast majority of the cores we take, we do bring them back intact. For a study in really soft sediments where we really want to be sure that we get the 20th century distinguished from the previous century, we might choose to slice up a core. Although I haven't done a lot of that lately because we've discovered that you can get things back surprisingly reliably intact as a whole core. It seems to actually work pretty well.
Another question from Rob Dean. What about the deformation of the cores at the edges from the PVC? Is that a problem?
Totally depends on the consistency of the sediments. If they're really sticky, varved sediments actually sort of a classic physical sedimentological varved sediments that are quite inorganic and tend to be sticky and clayey, really stick to the tube, and so yeah, you get this bowed shape. We do what we can in the field to avoid that. It helps to have a larger diameter core tube and a heavier weight so that you're, instead of tapping, you're bamming the tube down into the mud. But it really depends mostly on sediment consistency. And so sometimes we do get really bad bowing. And then it makes everything a lot harder in the lab. But if you have sediments that have nice stratigraphic markers along the way, nice clear layers, you at least can see where you are in the stratigraphy, even when it's bowed. If you're working with sediment that's very homogeneous, then you may not even know you have that problem. That's when it's really problematic. But luckily, the most organic bioturbated sediments tend to be the ones that are the most homogeneous, where you can't see those, you can't trace the layers very well. Those sediments also tend to not bow as much because they're not as sticky, I guess. And I know that from working in Iceland, where we have, even in the most organic goose poopy looking mud, we have periodic ash layers that provide perfect little stratigraphic markers to trace.
So we have two more questions. Do you want to take these now or you want to wait?
Sure, let's do two more and then we'll move on.
Okay, so Ann Tahansky asks, how do you know the lake is old enough to have a long record you can use?
Yeah, that's a good question. We have to take a best guess typically about a lot of things about a lake before we ever see it in person, and maybe before anyone's even seen it in person. So there's always a little risk involved. But with the age of the lake, which is a really important thing to get right for some of our questions, the most important thing to know about a site is usually something about its glacial geologic history. And so knowing the local glacial geology, the moraine dating in the region, that kind of stuff is what we would rely upon to kind of guess what the basal age of a lake record might be. I don't know if does that answer the question adequately, or do you have a follow-up?
No follow-up. I think that gets at, Ann can ask again at the end.
Okay.
So the last question for right now is from Bruce Geller, and he wonders if you were the designer of the core sampling device, and has it ever been used in paleoseismic studies?
So I have tweaked devices that were designed by people decades ago. So I have kind of my own slight twists on everything based on exactly how I like to do things. But the basic design has been around for a long time. On the other hand, a lot of what you saw in terms of our equipment is stuff that I built in my backyard with my dad. So although the designs have been around for a long time, we tweak them and we end up building a lot of our own equipment. And then paleoseismic studies. Lakes have definitely been used in paleoseismic studies, but I don't know much about it. So maybe, I don't know, maybe we can talk sometime. All right, I think I'll move on if that sounds good, Ben.
Yes.
Okay. Question 2 that we're going to tackle more briefly is how unusual is recent glacier retreat around the Arctic? And to get at that, we're going to travel to southern Greenland and look at work that's being done by my current PhD student, Laura LaRocca. She's using lakes like this one to reconstruct the Holocene history of mountain glaciers in Greenland that are shrinking today, to kind of know what their longer term history has been. And probably the first thing, or one of the first things that jumps out to you about this image is the color of that lake water. It's that gorgeous aqua color that just screams there's a glacier somewhere nearby. Because that aqua color is coming from rock flour that's washed into the lake and is reflecting light, sort of silt that's suspended in the lake water. This is a satellite image of a random stretch of West Greenland where you can see a lot of glaciers. Almost all the white on the image is glaciers, and a whole lot of lakes of all kinds of different colors, ranging from a really light aqua color to kind of a sapphire blue to black. Most of the lakes in the image are black. Almost everything black in the image is a lake. And those black lakes are clear water lakes that are topographically protected from glacial meltwater. That's why they have clear water. And as lakes get more and more impacted by incoming glacial meltwater, they get a milkier and milkier, more and more turquoise look. The glacier that's circled near the bottom of the image is, the lake that's circled near the bottom of the image, that really aqua colored lake, is adjacent to a glacier. So it's just getting glacier rock flour just dumped into it. Very milky water. You can imagine, if you can see these differences in a satellite image, there should be different kinds of mud being deposited at the bottoms of these lakes, and indeed there are. So in that bottom aqua colored circled lake that's right next to the glacier, I would bet a lot of money that the mud that's landing in the bottom of that lake looks like glacial rock flour. It's almost pure minerogenic material. It's gray, clay, and silt without a lot of organic material, because there's not a lot of organisms that can thrive in a lake where no light is penetrating through the water. And in contrast, in that black lake circled near the top with clear water, there's lots of light making its way down through the lake water. A very happy ecosystem happening in their primary producers and a food chain. And so sediments at the bottom of that lake are going to be mostly made up of biogenic materials, organic materials. They're going to be fluffy brown mud. Fluffy brown mud versus gray minerogenic mud. These are cores taken from a lake that currently has a glacier in its watershed, but didn't used to. And so your second pop quiz of the night is to find the transition between a glacial environment and a non-glacial environment. And hopefully you spotted it. This is a pretty satisfying form of paleolimnology because it's one of the only questions we can answer without even splitting open a core if we have a core tube. But of course we get a lot more detailed than that. And this is a figure from part of Laura's work where she's measured a bunch of things in a sediment core that tell her more about what the mud is made out of, to confirm which sections are dominantly rock flour and which sections record a lake with a thriving ecosystem in contrast. So that gray band is showing you the period over which there's brown, organic rich mud with very little mineral input being deposited. And then above and below that, you have rock flour dominated sediments. And Laura has used radiocarbon dating of plant remains to date the sediments. And those dates are over on the left. And you can see from those dates that there was a period of about 4,000 years when there was no glacier in the catchment of this lake. This lake has a glacier in its watershed today. And the other thing that we can say with the data that are in front of you right now is when the present day glacier first formed in the watershed, and that would be around 1,400 years ago based on radiocarbon dating here. So Laura has pulled together a summary of all the places in Greenland where people have done work like this on mountain glaciers and ice caps, so not the ice sheet itself, but these outlying smaller glaciers. And this figure, in classic paleoclimatologist fashion, I'm just moving the time dimension every which way on you. This figure, time is marching from right to left. So 11,000 years ago is on the right, the x-axis, and present day is at that 0. And there is a period of time here when you see a lot of gray bars above the time axis. Those gray bars are telling you, everywhere you see a gray bar, a present day glacier was either smaller than it is today or completely gone. And so there's a lot of time in the Holocene when a lot of these glaciers that have been studied that are present on the landscape today were not around or were smaller than they are today. So stare at those gray bars. They represent a period in the early to middle Holocene when that same Milankovitch forcing that I was talking about before caused a long period of warmer than modern conditions around the Arctic, including Greenland. And so this is the last time that we saw widespread disappearance of many glaciers or shrinking of many glaciers smaller than they are today. But this glacier retraction was driven by a very well understood natural climate forcing, which we know drove the Arctic to be warmer than it is today because summer sunshine was more intense. Following that, summer sunshine became increasingly less intense over time. The Arctic gradually cooled over thousands of years, and we started to grow the glaciers that we see on the landscape today. And in fact, this work shows that most of the glaciers that are on the landscape in Greenland today are thousands of years old. So if they do disappear in this century or in the coming centuries, that would be an event that's unprecedented since the middle Holocene or thereabouts, when Milankovitch forcing forced the Arctic to be warmer than it is right now. Obviously, a connected question is, what has been the recent fate of glaciers like the ones you just saw Holocene stories about, and what will be their future fate? And that's the piece of Laura's dissertation that she's still working on now, and she's given me permission to show you a few preliminary figures from her work. To do this, to assess what's happened with these small mountain glaciers in Greenland over the last 130 years, she's going to have to use totally different techniques, not paleolimnology now, but geospatial analysis of air photos and satellite images, combined with mapping moraines from a recent advance of these glaciers. So there was a period called the Little Ice Age that was particularly pronounced around the high latitude northern hemisphere, England, parts of Northwest Europe, Greenland, parts of northeastern North America were a lot colder than today for several hundred years on average during the Little Ice Age. Remember, this is the culmination of thousands and thousands of years of gradual Milankovitch forced cooling in that part of the world. And so it's naturally very cold. And you may have had more volcanic eruptions or feedbacks from sea ice that caused particularly cold conditions for a few hundred years during that Little Ice Age. And so these glaciers left moraines on the landscape. That's the green line that you see here adjacent to this glacier. It's its extent during the Little Ice Age. All the other colored lines are time slices that Laura has outlined in different aerial photos and satellite images to capture the history of this glacier. Now, until very recently, this kind of analysis would have been limited to the 1980s and beyond, the satellite era, when we had satellite images of decent enough resolution to look at small glaciers. But that's not very satisfying or much of a record. luckily, Laura and I and undergrad Jeremy Brooks, who did a thesis with Laura and has moved on to Wisconsin for a PhD, have the privilege of collaborating with Anders Bjork, who's a Danish scientist at the University of Copenhagen and the Danish Natural History Museum, where there is a remarkable collection of air photos taken by guys like these guys in the photo here, who were sent out by the Danish crown in the early to middle 20th century, basically to map Greenland as a way to try to claim it, more or less, for Denmark. They were sent out in open cockpit airplanes to fly over Greenland, take a bunch of pictures so that maps could be developed, and Denmark could say, we know more about this place than anyone else, therefore it makes sense for us to essentially claim it. Those photos were kind of lost to history for a long time, many of them, but they've kind of come out of the woodwork, literally out of family members' basements in the last decade. And Laura is going to be able to access these old expedition photos to get more time slices, more glimpses of the history of these little glaciers around Greenland. And I think this is my last data slide. This is preliminary from Laura, and it's comparing her results of doing this with results of several other studies that have taken the same approach recently in different parts of Greenland. So she worked in the south, and that yellow box that you see on the left and the yellow line on the time plot is her result for the south, and the other colors are other studies. There's a lot going on in the time plot, but to walk you through it quickly, so what's plotted there is the rate of retreat of the front of the glaciers that were studied. A value over 0, a positive value, would be growth of the glacier moving forward. And you don't see any of that. So there's no time period for any of these glaciers when they are advancing. All we see here is retreat, but we see a lot of variation in rate of retreat. And one consistent thing between all or most of the sites, I think all, is that the fastest rate of retreat is the very beginning of this record, between 1890 or 1900 and the next time slice. That's the time period right after the Little Ice Age, when basically the only measurements we can make are to take the Little Ice Age moraine and the first aerial photo ever taken of a glacier and compare those two data points. And it appears that retreat right after coming out of the Little Ice Age was quite rapid, which isn't that surprising because it was the coldest cold snap of the Holocene. And coming out of that, you might expect the glaciers to adjust. Now, it's long been an argument made by climate skeptics that the widespread glacier retreat we're seeing around the world today is just glaciers coming out of the Little Ice Age. It's just a long, protracted response to coming out of the Little Ice Age, and therefore doesn't necessarily say anything about 20th century warming. This data set is interesting because it starts to be able to address that for Greenland's mountain glaciers, because the other really clear feature that I see in Laura's compilation is that for all of these parts of Greenland, the rate of glacier retreat ramped up around 2000, the year 2000 again. So glacier retreat accelerated after 2000 AD, and that can't be a response to the Little Ice Age. That has to be a response to late 20th century, 21st century warming. And it looks an awful lot like the acceleration of Greenland ice sheet loss that I showed you very early in the talk. So that's walking you through those two research questions. There's so much else I would love to talk about, and I, in particular, wish that I had time to talk about some of our studies that are a little more fun and quirky and not about the very alarming impacts of climate change. Climate can be, it's always fun to study. It can be fun and not alarming occasionally. If you want to hear one of those stories and you know Everett, I highly recommend that you ask him how he, in the words of CNN, solved the climate mystery of the Vikings with one of his projects. As far as I know, there's no cliche that says that scientists start to look like their research subjects over time, but I'm kind of wondering a little bit. I want to leave you with a few quick take-home points. One, the Arctic obviously is warming very rapidly. Two, paleolimnology confirms that this recent warming is very unusual. But even to me, like even more important than the rate or amount of warming is its cause. And geologic records are telling us that the cause of this present day warming is something unique as well. And it looks like land ice loss in Greenland has accelerated since about 2000 AD. And that of course has implications for global sea level rise. Quick broader take home points. Zooming out from the Arctic and just thinking more globally about the problem of climate change, I want to be sure to emphasize that even though there's lots of disagreement among scientists about all kinds of things having to do with climate, and that's why we still have research to do and conferences to go to and angry paper responses to write and all that good stuff. There's a lot that we agree upon. There's just an unprecedented consensus among scientists about really important features of climate change. For one, that it's real, that climate is warming on average globally right now. Two, that it's us, that we are the primary cause of that warming. Three, that the net effects of climate change are negative for humanity. It presents some opportunities, but it presents even more challenges and problems. But four, and maybe this is the most important one, there is hope. In particular, the fact that we hold the knobs now, that we control climate, as alarming as that is, it's also an incredible source of power. We really do have the power to choose to dramatically slow the rate of climate change, to dramatically decrease the amount of climate change that we're going to experience. We, humanity alone, have that power, and it is power. And I hope we'll use it. So I will just leave you with that thought and a big thank you and a couple of reading recommendations. These are just books that I have read in the last year that have really affected the way that I see things, and I think you might enjoy them as well. So thank you, and I'll take questions.
All right. Well, thank you very much. That was a fantastic talk. I think the evidence of that is Professor Potter has actually said thank you, and that he thinks, and he's seen all of them, that this is one of the best talks of any of the Potter Lecture Series talks. So you stand at the top of some very good company. So,
wow, I appreciate that.
That is fantastic. So we do have a number of questions, and we won't do this forever, but we will try to take a number of these until Yarrow decides that she's had enough. So the first one is a follow-up from Anne, and she had said, just to kind of reiterate, that she was, again, just curious how lakes are selected. You know, how do you decide to go to Baffin Island as opposed to Ellesmere, as opposed to, you know, Greenland or Iceland or wherever?
So that those big picture choices of continent and country, some of that is the culture of science and sort of who you choose to collaborate with or who you do your PhD with. You know, we all kind of have regions of specialization, and so I've been lucky in my career to bounce between working with people who have deep histories working in Alaska or in Arctic Canada or in Iceland, and have had opportunities to work in those places because of that. On the other hand, I chose to start working in Greenland for very conscious reasons. Well, partly because all of my advisors worked in Iceland and Canada and Alaska, and Greenland was what was left in the Western Hemisphere. But also, it started to become clear to me around the time I was finishing my PhD that we just did not know nearly enough about the Greenland ice sheet, and that understanding what that thing does when climate gets warmer is, it has to be a scientific priority for quaternary scientists going forward. And so I did kind of choose Greenland specifically for scientific reasons. And then but that's really a different question than kind of how you choose a specific lake to work on. And that's, very idiosyncratic depending on the particular research questions you're trying to tackle. And your earlier question got at probably the first tier question that we ask, which is what amount of time do we need to capture to answer our research question? Are we trying to learn something about things that happened 12,000 years ago, 120,000 years ago, or 200 years ago? And we're limited. Very few places can we get 120,000 year records from the Arctic. Relatively few can we get 12,000 year records because there's so much ice from the Laurentide ice sheet and the expanded Greenland ice sheet still around 12,000 years ago. If you want the last 200 years, you can go almost anywhere. But if you want a climate signal that's not confounded by point source pollution into a lake or something like that, then you better, go somewhere remote and avoid something very close to a town, for example. But the actual process of picking individual lakes, once we kind of know a general region and a question, involves actually a lot of time on Google Earth, and it's one of my very, very favorite things to do, to just kind of soar over a region in Google Earth and try to figure out what lakes sit in the right context to answer a question.
Okay, thanks. So the next question is from actually another former retired Dickinson faculty member, Jeff Nemitz, and he asked, do you have any indication of the rate of glacial melting in mid-Holocene compared to anthropogenic melting recently?
Yeah, good question. I would say we don't for the mountain glaciers, and it's been a tough nut to crack for the Greenland ice sheet, but there was a recent study came out in Science or Nature just maybe a month or two ago, that did make a direct comparison for about a quarter of the Greenland ice sheet, the southwest quadrant of it. And they argued that present day retreat looks quite similar to the earliest Holocene, when the ice sheet was retreating quite quickly. But that modeled future retreat is going to be a lot faster. So like we've approached the rate of the early Holocene already, and we're about to exceed it.
Wow. Okay, so next question is from Go Big Green, and I'm not sure I know exactly what diagram the question is talking about, but we'll try it. So there's a graph that had gray versus blue bars, and the question is, I understand how you would tell if they were not present, but how do you know when the glaciers were smaller than they are now? Were they small enough not to feed the lake? Yeah, this is the diagram probably.
Yeah, so there are some watersheds where, as long as there's even a teeny tiny glacier in that watershed, it's always going to send meltwater to the lake. And so you've got to completely eliminate that glacier to lose the rock flower signal. That's where you get the solid gray bars. And then the hatched gray bars are a more complex setting where a glacier just has to retreat behind some kind of hill to no longer be able to send its meltwater to the lake, and the meltwater goes elsewhere. We call those threshold systems. we like to look for them because they give us this sort of nuance of an in-between. Smaller, they can show us when glaciers were smaller without them having to be completely gone. But it's about topographic thresholds.
Okay. We have a comment and a question from Greeley and Old's family. It starts off, I was not aware of the Milankovitch forcing acted since 10,000 years ago. The more intense summer sun must have affected past historical civilizations. The question is, where does the Younger Dryas period fit into your time frame?
Ooh, well, the grant that I just got funded is to investigate the Younger Dryas on Greenland. The Younger Dryas occurred roughly 13 to 11,500 years ago, right before the start of the Holocene. And there are very, very few records of the Younger Dryas on land in Greenland because at that time, the Greenland Ice Sheet still was smothering basically everything that is present day land. So there just weren't lakes on Greenland sitting on rock looking up at the atmosphere. The ice sheet was kind of smothering everything at that time. But there were a couple teeny bits of land that were poking out from the ice where there were lakes. And we were starting to investigate what happened at those lakes to try to understand some things about Younger Dryas climate change.
Very good. Okay, so
yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Go on.
So next question from Ivy. When sediment is deposited from melting glaciers, what effect does it have on the surrounding area? Does it cause unusual occurrences in surrounding waterways, destabilize land, etc.?
I'm just going to read that question. Yeah. So some places have catastrophic outbursts, sort of sudden outbursts of massive quantities of glacial meltwater and sediments, and Iceland is predisposed to that, partly because it's got volcanoes under its glaciers, so that's like as exciting as things can possibly get. But they have a pretty intense natural hazard from outbursts of glacial materials that can tear up roads and bridges and so on. So that's kind of an extreme example of that. But just more generally, glacier retreat is certainly changing these landscapes. I'd say the scale of the areas that have been abandoned by glaciers so far is pretty small in a place like Greenland because Greenland's just so big. So geomorphically, it's not a huge factor in kind of what the broad scale landscape looks like and how it behaves, but it definitely like locally can change how much dust is in the air in the summer, the frequency of flooding of rivers that flow under bridges and, you know, cause problems for infrastructure and so on.
Okay, very good. So next question is from Haley. Have you ever had the opportunity to speak to any community members in the areas where you do field work about the impacts of the trends you're studying on their lives?
Yeah, I love that question. In some places more than others, it's something that we want to do more of in Greenland. My next lab group meeting will be brainstorming ways that we might be able to engage more with communities in Greenland and learn from them and share what we're learning and hopefully have a lot more rich back and forth. But in cases where I have had those opportunities, people are, you know, and so I'm thinking of Arctic Canada in particular, and Baffin Island is probably the place where I've talked with folks most. And that's a place that is locked in sea ice almost all of the year right now, and where that is changing quite rapidly, and where culturally for thousands of years, people have used the sea ice for all kinds of really, really important things, like going to see family, which is like something that we can all relate to now. Like, what if suddenly we couldn't go see our family during the traditional holidays? I can relate to that now. the loss of sea ice is changing, you know, people's ability to move around, visit people, hunt, and they're very aware of that in communities in the north, painfully aware. They're also at the same time coping with cultural changes and environmental problems like buildup of PCBs in marine mammals and in human breast milk that are essentially unrelated to climate change. They're basically dealing with just an incredible onslaught of one challenge after another, and climate change is just yet another. If you can read Sheila Watt-Cloutier's book, it's stunning.
Yeah. Yes, we'll talk more about this on Friday. Next question from another alum, Jake Davidson. How do the mountain glaciers you're looking at interact with the Greenland ice sheet as a whole?
Well, they function, like glaciologically, they function very independently, which is nice because whereas the Greenland ice sheet is this sleeping giant, and it takes a long time to wake up, and we think, we actually don't really know, but we think it takes quite a while to respond to a rapid climate change. These little mountain glaciers are agile little speedsters, and they respond quite quickly. On the other hand, you know, the ice sheet can kind of make its own weather in some ways. So when glaciers are tucked up near it, I'm sure they're affected by that. That's the biggest interaction I can think of.
Great. And another quick question from Pete Sack. This is an interesting question. It relates to your satellite image of the lakes that are different colors. So he makes the observation: rock flower impacted lakes are clearly sensitive to landscape position and the glacial extent in the modern system, as you can see in the satellite image. In light of this, how representative is a single lake core for reconstructing regional patterns in the past?
So I think a single lake core can do a good job telling you about glaciers within a single watershed. But the bigger question there is how representative are glaciers in a single watershed of regional climate, I guess. And absolutely, we would expect that some glaciers will stick around despite a large amount of warming, because they're really big today, because they sit really high on the landscape, for example, whereas a teeny little glacier that's just barely hanging on in modern climate might just disappear right away if climate warms ever so slightly. So those will look very different in the green and gray bar scenario, right? So it is, I think, really important to recognize that the glaciers are registering potentially different degrees of climate change, and it's actually the power is really in looking at a diversity of glaciers across space and time to try to tease out the bigger picture. So in Laura's study in the south, she specifically cored lakes in 3 watersheds that had very different glacier characteristics. One was this teeny glacier barely holding on, and one had a lot of ice, and she wanted to see if they yielded very different stories. And they yielded somewhat different stories in the ways that we expected, but they were actually much more closer in time to one another than we expected in terms of when they disappeared and reappeared.
Okay, couple more. Are you good to keep going for a little while longer?
Sure.
Okay. We have from the next question is, what would be the best analog for the information that can be gleaned from dendrochronology / extant living organisms for historical climate change in cryospheric regions or regions where there's glacial retreat?
So I'm wondering if that question is by analog, if the question is like, can we get the information as detailed in time about glaciers as we can about dendro?
That seems reasonable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me think about that. It's tough. I mean, so there are some settings where varved lakes, those annual layers, have provided that kind of information. There's a now pretty classic study from Iceland that has glacier signatures embedded in varved sediments, so they can count the years, how many years for which there was ice rafted debris and thus ice calving into the lake versus how many years was there just rock flour washing in on streams, and therefore the ice wasn't actually calving into the lake but must have retreated. So if you get a lake with a high enough sedimentation rate, and ideally varves, which allow you to then date things with a lot of precision, you might start to get there. But it's really tough, I think. On the other hand, for the last century, where we have air photos, we can do really detailed reconstructions of glacier sizes.
Okay, so we're just about done with questions. Another question from one of our Earth Science majors, Patrick. He wonders if there are specific layers in the sediments that may be harder to identify, certain types of sediments that are harder to distinguish what they are or what caused them in the lake cores.
We definitely end up with a lot of mysteries. I see Everett laughing. He's been there. Yeah, you know, it's sometimes you come down to data that tell you that things got screwed up in the field when you took the core, and that's the worst kind of information. But I mean, you're really glad when you realize it. You try to do a really careful job looking at your stratigraphy and dating a core to confirm that that wasn't the case. But that's kind of the worst case scenario, is you just realize, well, things are just real screwed up. But that actually doesn't happen that often. Yeah, there's lots of stuff that's ambiguous in these sediments, and you know, we try to ask questions that we can answer with some confidence, you know, to look for the most robust kinds of signals that we're likely to see. But sometimes we find ourselves dealing with pretty ambiguous signals. Yeah.
All right. Well, this has been fantastic, and we've taken a lot of your time for one evening, and we very, very much appreciate you sharing time with us, and we look forward to another short visit on Friday for your class visit. But thank you very much. It's been fantastic, and I think everyone has learned a lot. You're an incredibly clear speaker, so that's fantastic, especially for this sort of a virtual setting when that's really important. Thank you everyone that's been with us. We've had apparently close to 100 people watching the YouTube stream, so very, very pleased to honor Professor Potter this way, and I'm sure he's very pleased that you were here to give this talk. Well, here virtually. We'll get you on campus sometime. Maybe not for another 6 months, but at some point. And yeah, sorry.
I said thank you, Yarrow. It's Noel.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, and thanks for the kind words.
So thank you everyone for being with us. We appreciate you all. Have a good, safe night. Take care of yourselves, stay healthy, and thank you for joining us for this year's Potter Lecture.
Good night. Thanks.